Science, Fiction, and the Magician. How L. Ron Hubbard conjured Scientology and helped spawn the UFO cults. Lafayette Ronald Hubbard did not create Scientology from original material. For example, in his early Dianetics practice, we can see clearly the influence of Freud, Jung, and other thinkers available in the mid-19th century, as well as the influence of popular self-help works such as Norman Vincent Peale's best-selling The Power of Positive Thinking, religious studies professor Hugh Urban writes. Hubbard had no real expertise, however, so he had to invent it. He claimed that he had learned psychoanalysis from a U.S. Navy commander, had been made a blood brother of the Blackfoot tribe, and toured China, India, and Tibet to learn Eastern wisdom as a boy. Hubbard had even studied under the last remaining magician from the line of Kublai Khan's court. Son of a Navy officer based on Guam, Hubbard did in fact visit China and the Philippines in 1927. However, his accounts of this tour are contradictory, and his diary shows he cared little for monks or temples. Rather, he expressed contempt for the local population. There is no sign of Freudian analysis, zero appreciation for classic literature, nor any expression of interest in philosophical systems in his diary. Despite his later claims that Scientology was the Western successor to Buddhism, the young Hubbard was unimpressed by his encounter with that religion. Thus, there is little evidence that Hubbard cared much about spiritual matters as a young man. As an adult, however, Hubbard joined the ancient mystical order Rosicrucis, which is still the largest Rosicrucian organization in the world, for 6 months during 1940. Based on a series of anonymous pamphlets printed in the early 17th century, just after the Age of Alchemists, Rosicrucianism is a syncretized blend of the Corpus Hermeticum, Kabbalah mysticism, and Gnostic Christianity. War interrupted Hubbard's spiritual path. Discharged from the Navy in December 1945, Hubbard resumed his interest in magic with Jack Parsons, a co-founder of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Parsons led the Agape Lodge of Ordo Templi Orientis, known as OTO, in Los Angeles. Founded by Freemasons at the beginning of the 20th century, the OTO was an occult blend of Rosicrucianism, theosophy, and sexual magic that belonged to Aleister Crowley's Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Although Crowley mostly agreed with the work of Helena Blavatsky, he disdained Ani Besant, her successor leader in the Church of Theosophy, as a rival, claiming that he alone was on the correct path to spiritual enlightenment through magic rituals. Calling his retake on Theosophy Thelema, Crowley maintained a tight grip on his underlings. Parsons dutifully kept his master up to date on his new friendship. Hubbard, quote, is the most thelemic person I have ever met and is completely in accord with our own principles, Parsons wrote to Crowley. He was in need of a partner in sorcery, he said, and Hubbard fit the bill. Although Ron has no formal training in magic, he has an extraordinary amount of experience and understanding in the field. From some of his experiences, I deduce he is in touch with some higher intelligence, possibly his guardian angel. He describes his angel as a beautifully winged woman with red hair whom he calls the Empress, and who has guided him through his life and saved him many times. Just months later, however, they were bitter enemies. Hubbard then embarked on creating his own religion thereafter, borrowing freely from Crowley's magic, spelled with a K. Textual critics have identified Crowley's Book of the Law as one of Hubbard's sources. According to his estranged son, Ronald Edward DeWolf, also known as Nibs, Hubbard never actually stopped practicing Crowleyan magic. In turn, during its early history, Scientology helped inspire the first flying saucer cults, including one of the most famous in the world. On his way to becoming infamous himself, L. Ron Hubbard thus played a small but crucial role in the transformation of 19th century theosophy into alien contact narratives. Hubbard's teenage diary is revealing. Former Scientologist John Attic notes that when Hubbard visited his father on Guam a second time in 1928, he wrote two different accounts of the trip in his notebook. They are within a few pages of one another, yet they differ in detail, Attic writes. Although Hubbard wrote many imaginative stories, his own past became his most elaborate work of fiction. Many of these entries were written for an audience, he says. A vulnerable narcissist, Hubbard was already making a habit of elaborating his past, thus reinventing himself over and over again. He adopted more than 15 pseudonyms as an author of pulp fiction. Much of this writing was in the new genre of science fiction, but contrary to his pretensions, Hubbard was never a scientist. He failed the math exam for admittance to the U.S. Naval Academy, for example, then made a specious claim later to have been one of the first students of nuclear physics at George Washington University. A book he published later on the topic of radiation, creatively titled All About Radiation, was therefore derided correctly as pseudoscience. Scientists wrote letters to the magazines that printed his scientific short stories to criticize his poor grounding in actual science. Magicians have a much easier job than scientists, of course, because they work with imaginary forces and ineffable spirits rather than empirical data. Crowley, who insisted Thelema was a science, still understood this when he cautioned his acolytes against attributing objective reality or philosophic validity to any invisible entity they contacted from ethereal realms. A performative, gregarious man, Hubbard was auditioning for the role of scribe that Parsons assigned to him. It helped that Parsons was hardly secure in his own position. Crowley had made Parsons head of the OTO after dismissing Parsons' rival. Perhaps acting on intelligence he had gleaned from others living in the mansion, Hubbard claimed one night to be experiencing some sort of astral vision, according to Parsons, describing in detail the rival, of whom he had never heard, and later the guardian forms of Isis and the Archangel Michael. Hubbard then attacked this figure and pinned it to the door with 4 throwing knives, with which he is expert. The grandiose display of circus skills concealed another agenda. For as soon as Hubbard had moved into the mansion with Parsons, he pulled his most audacious stunt of all in this period by stealing Parsons' girlfriend, Sarah Betty Northrup, the future mother of Nibs. A libertine like Crowley, Parsons did not seem to mind. Hubbard may have already begun selling Parsons on a magical ritual to summon a new, better girlfriend, a goddess, in fact. Hubbard helped Parsons with this magical project by revealing rituals for Parsons to perform that would summon Babylon, spelled Babalon. Crowley, who called himself the Great Beast, wanted the name of the goddess to better fit his divine numerology. Following a period of, quote, great tension and unease, the two men were driving in the Mojave Desert when, quote, the feeling of tension suddenly snapped, according to Parsons. I turned to him and said, "It is done, in absolute certainty that the operation was accomplished." I returned home and found a young woman answering the requirements waiting for me. She is describable as an air of fire type with bronze red hair, fiery and subtle, determined and obstinate, sincere and perverse, with extraordinary personality, talent, and intelligence. Her name was Marjorie Elizabeth Cameron. Parsons spent the next 5 weeks in bed with her, constantly invoking Babylon. Cameron only realized later that this was sex magic. Tantric yoga was among the Eastern influences that Crowley had imported into Thelema, and Parsons was an enthusiastic practitioner. However, Parsons had far bigger ambitions than torrid romance, for he had developed an obsession with a character from Crowley's fiction. Written in 1917 and published in 1929, Moonchild was supposed to introduce readers to Crowleyan magic. In the novel, Babylon is made manifest on Earth as a young woman and must choose between two magicians at war with one another. Parsons, on the other hand, had already worried Crowley by introducing witchcraft and voodoo into OTO rituals against his instructions. Now Parsons was intent on producing Babylon in the non-fictional flesh of a daughter. When Crowley learned of their activities, he called both men goats, a magical reference as well as a sexual one, to express his displeasure on every level. They were tinkering with magic spells as they had with rockets, Gene Foreman, a witness to the Babylon working, recalls. On the second night of March, Hubbard demonstrated his ability to see into the astral plane by describing, quote, a vision he had that evening of a savage and beautiful woman riding naked on a great cat-like beast. Using the system of Enochian divination devised by the Elizabethans John Dee and Edward Kelly, Hubbard channeled the desired goddess. Urban continues to quote Parsons. The catastrophic trend is due to our lack of understanding of our own natures. The hidden lusts, fears, and hatreds resulting from the warping of the love urge, which underlie the natures of all Western peoples, have taken a homicidal and suicidal direction. This force needs to be counterbalanced by another sort of force called Babylon. Quote, the nature of this force relates to love, understanding, and Dionysian freedom. The invocation of Babylon was thus, according to Parsons, an attempt to prevent the world from being destroyed. Although no goddess was produced by this union, Crowley's suspicions about Hubbard were confirmed in April when he learned that Hubbard had set Parsons up for a swindle. Hubbard proposed that his mark invest $20,000, almost Parsons' entire fortune, in the scheme while investing a little over $1,000 of his own money. The plan was for Hubbard to travel to the East Coast with Betty Northrup, purchase discount yachts, and sail them to the West Coast for resale at a profit. Disgruntled OTO members, now suspicious of Hubbard, informed Crowley. Disappointment in the inexperienced lodge leader would only deepen. When he stopped receiving messages from Hubbard, Parsons realized that he had been chiseled and rushed to Florida. There he cast a spell at the dock, and a subsequent squall prevented the couple from making their getaway. Forced to appear in a Miami courtroom, Hubbard settled with Parsons out of court. Though he disowned credit for the weather event, Parsons did tell Crowley about it with great relish, and perhaps too much color, for Crowley dismissed him as the head of the Agape Lodge shortly thereafter. Parsons soon found the government had come to distrust him as well, due to his pre-war dalliance with Marxism. Parsons died in an explosion at his home laboratory in 1952. A practitioner of Thelema herself, Cameron kept the name Babylon until her own death in 1995. Hubbard was finished as a potential magus of Thelema, but he was soon at work remixing Crowley's remixed theosophy into Scientology. Amazingly, this is a matter of record thanks to the Church of Scientology. Alex Mitchell, an Australian Trotskyist and opponent of Scientology, wrote an expose of the Babylon working for the Sunday Times of London in 1969. Scientology sued the newspaper. In another settlement out of court, the Times agreed to publish an absurd revision of the story, according to the pen of L. Ron Hubbard himself. In the new version of events, Hubbard claimed that the government had sent him on a, quote, mission to break up, quote, black magic in America during 1946, pointing to the politics of the conveniently deceased Parsons. Quote, "The house was torn down. Hubbard rescued a girl they were using. The black magic group was dispersed and never recovered," Hubbard wrote. During 1946 and 47, Hubbard intensified his astral visions to compose the first drafts of what was to become Scientology. Both the affirmations, also known as the admissions, and the blood ritual were acknowledged in court records during the 1980s, although the latter was not read into the record, with Scientology's counsel arguing it was deeply personal. However, it was described to the court as an Egyptian invocation. According to Nibs, Hubbard claimed his guardian angel was Hathor, the mother of Horus in the pantheon of the ancient Nile. Urban, a historian of religion, observes that in Thelema, quote, "contact with one's guardian angel is the most important aim of the magus, for the guardian is in fact his truest self, his star or inmost light, and original individual eternal essence." Urban quotes the affirmations at length. "God and your guardian and your own power bring destruction on those who would injure you. But you never speak of this, for you are kind. A sphere of light, invisible to others, surrounds you as a protecting globe. All forces bounce away from you off this. You are a child of God. You are perfect. The most thrilling thing in your life is your love and consciousness of your guardian. She materializes for you. You have no doubts of her. She is real. She is always with you. You are eternal. You are satisfied to live within God. You have and will live forever. You are part of God. You are the crown prince of your small section of the universe." Hubbard claimed that he wrote Dianetics in 3 weeks through automatic writing dictated by that same empress, noted by Parsons, who had guided him through his life and saved him many times. Widespread in 19th century theosophy and borrowed from American spiritualism, this practice was still very much in vogue at the time. Indeed, it is not uncommon in New Age spirituality today. Hubbard made no effort to cover up his influences. On the contrary, he called, quote, the late Aleister Crowley, who had died in 1947, "my very good friend," in one of the scores of lectures he recorded for his Philadelphia doctorate course in Scientology during December 1952. Quote, Crowley did himself a splendid piece of aesthetics built around those magical cults. It's very interesting reading to get a hold of a copy of a book, quite rare, but it can be obtained, The Master Therian. He signs himself The Beast. The Mark of the Beast, 666. Very, very something or other. Crowley exhumed a lot of the data from these old magic cults, and he, as a matter of fact, handles cause and effect quite a bit. Cause and effect is handled according to a ritual, and that ritual is what you do in order to accomplish this, or how you have to go through and how many motions you have to make. Each ritual is a cycle of some sort or another. Now, a magician, getting back to cause and effect and Alistair's work, a magician postulates what his goal will be before he starts to accomplish what he's doing. And the magician was very ritualistic, and he would very carefully postulate what effect he was trying to achieve before he would be cause for that effect. Religion scholar Henrique Bogdan writes that, quote, Hubbard sees a direct continuity between Crowley's magical rituals and the techniques of Scientology, and he describes these as practical techniques involving a specific cycle of action intended to produce a desired effect. Bogdan points to the practice of, quote, exteriorizing thetans, which is almost identical to Crowley's account of projecting the body of light. This reimagined astral travel, quote, is not an imaginary exercise. The individual really is engaged in an out-of-body planetary tour and should recognize it as such, according to Hubbard himself. Even the ethics were borrowed. Hubbard's self-determinism sounds almost indistinguishable from Crowley's law of Thelema, or do what thou wilt, Bogdan writes, for both rest upon a fundamental belief in the infinite power of the individual will, and both share the idea of total freedom of the self from all limitations. Scientologists are not just present with God, they are gods in the making. America was the setting for the TV show Mad Men at this moment. Appropriate to the spirit of 1950, Hubbard promulgated his Science of the Human Mind in an advertisement. Joseph Campbell, the publisher of Astounding Science Fiction, who printed the advert with a flourish of endorsements, was suspicious of science and enthusiastic about the hidden powers of the human mind. Campbell grew disillusioned, however, as Hubbard spent the surge of money faster than it arrived, and his public demonstrations became embarrassing. Undeterred, Hubbard found a new mark in Wichita who, like all his predecessors, came to regret believing in the prophet of Dianetics. Hubbard managed to recover his copyrights, but the public was too wise to his scam. Another revision was in order. Hubbard now began to use the word Scientology instead of Dianetics. He made it an official religion in 1954. Magic is the science of understanding oneself and one's conditions, Crowley wrote. By this point, the Korean War and the H-bomb had established the battle lines of the Cold War in stark relief, intensifying the new anxieties of the post-war world, and once again, Hubbard applied thelemic magic, calling it science. Crowley had envisioned a new era in human history, an alchemy of beliefs that would unite the globe in peace. Americans had prayed for peace since 1939, and many were ripe for exploitation by anyone who promised to provide it. Urban writes that in the American religions that emerged after World War II, quote, many of the key components of modernity, such as the prioritization of individualism, rejection of tradition, faith in scientific and technological progress, and the belief in human perfectibility, are combined with esoteric discourses. Bogdan says that, quote, a movement that had elements of Golden Dawn, Crowley-style occultism mixed with Eastern religions and depth psychology would not have seemed strange by any means, but, on the contrary, extremely attractive to this particular spiritual market. Religious beliefs that were all the rage during the pre-war era of occult spirituality, sex, drugs, and jazz thus carried over seamlessly into the post-war era of occult spirituality, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Hubbard was, quote, one of the most creative, experimental, and eclectic new vendors in this marketplace, according to Urban. However, he writes that Crowley's work does indeed represent one important influence in Hubbard's complex system, but only one influence, which was mediated through Hubbard's own creative imagination and combined with a vast array of other religious, scientific, and literary influences. Urban uses the term bricoleur, a creative recycler of cultural wares, which he borrows from anthropologists Claude Lévi-Strauss and Wendy Doniger as a label for Hubbard. In her 2016 book Strange Rites: New Religions for a Godless World, religion reporter Tara Isabel Burton prefers to call this activity remixing. Astral travel was a tradition from yoga, for example, while the Enochian magic of Kelly and Dee was English, while Hubbard's guardian angel was Egyptian. Indeed, Hubbard was eager to claim foundations in every faith ever conceived, as well as credit for their discovery. For example, imitating Crowley, Hubbard reimagined Hindu reincarnation as free-floating thetans, using the term past lives to stamp his own brand on the ancient idea. So-called operating thetans resonate with the nirvana of the Buddha, who sought to end the cycle of rebirth by going clear, in Hubbard's telling. Hubbard claimed in The Factors, a 1953 policy statement, that Scientology is, quote, a Gnostic faith in that it knows it knows. He never articulated how this made his new religion different from its many Gnostic predecessors, however. Bogdan writes that, quote, Hubbard appears to have no substantive knowledge of Gnosticism. Yet, various scholars have pointed out that his ideal of the divine, immortal thetan, entrapped in the material realm, bears a certain resemblance to early Gnostic cosmologies. Religious historians Donald Westbrook and James Lewis call Hubbard's, quote, Gnostic sensibilities and language reminiscent of the book of Genesis. And they regard his cosmology, in which, quote, the existence of the universe itself is based on the mutual agreement of omnipotent thetans who have created it in the first place, as a riff on themes from ancient Gnosticism. Hubbard called his revelations, quote, a spiritual technology, rather than a faith or belief, encouraging believers to say they know Scientology is true, and that they have reality rather than faith in this technology. Rather than do the work to understand and articulate gnosis through the ages, Hubbard just restated it. From its beginning, conversions to the new religion of Scientology have tended to lie at the end of spiritual explorations of the same material. Bogdan notes that, quote, most of Scientology's early followers had been involved in various forms of occult, esoteric, magical, and alternative traditions long before joining Hubbard's movement. Bricoleurism was and still remains the spiritual foment of the times. Sociologist Roy Wallace, the first academic to publish a serious book on Scientology as a new religion, agrees that Hubbard's converts in the early 1950s were spiritual seekers. Quote, over half of them had prior involvement in marginal religions, Rosicrucianism, Theosophy, Christian Science, Baha'i, hypnosis, or Jungian analysis. Science, too, had created both wonders and terrors for humanity. Hubbard proposed to manage them both through spiritual power. Quote, Hubbard suggests that Crowley's magic was effective for realizing the spirit's potential for its time and place, but now Scientology can realize the same power of the spirit with new, more contemporary and scientific techniques, Bogdan explains. Indeed, Between 1946 and 1952, Christian theosophy produced a new manifestation in the cult of the extraterrestrial. Lord Xenu, the galactic overlord in Hubbard's scriptural prehistory of Earth, or Tegiak, and the villain in his story explaining the existence of Thetans, is widely understood as a product of the golden age of flying saucers. Westbrook and Lewis call it, quote, space opera theology. The role of theosophy and its intellectual inheritor Thelema in the formation of the UFO faith is less well known than Scientology. As this writer explained in a recent essay on George Adamski, the earliest alien contactee, the urge to fuse all the world's religious and magical and ritual traditions into a unified spiritual theory came out of the 19th century and shaped world religion until 1945. Thereafter, all new religions had to soothe nuclear nightmares, address the promises and perils of technology, and most importantly, tell a story of the world that began and ended in peace. All these themes are contained in the 1951 classic film The Day the Earth Stood Still. Adamski, a Christian theosophist, met Orthon, his alien friend from Venus, in 1952. This was the cultural matrix in which Hubbard developed his own cult. Hubbard added a Chicago location to his emerging faith during 1950. 4 years later, sensational news about a UFO cult in a suburb of that city, with believers predicting imminent apocalypse, made headlines around the world. They offered salvation. The believers would be evacuated ahead of the looming global flood in flying saucers. At least 4 members of this group, known as the Seekers, Dorothy Martin and Edna Post, the channelers of the group, as well as Bertha Black's. At least 4 members of this group, known as the Seekers, Dorothy Martin and Edna Post, the channelers of the group, as well as Bertha Blatsky and Dr. Charles Lafayette, had explored Scientology in their spiritual journeys. Burton writes that every human is on, quote, a pilgrimage none of us can get out of. And a surprising number of people have passed through Scientology on that pilgrimage, forming their own bricoleur faiths. 2 years after the predicted global flood had failed to materialize, a second group of academics revealed that they in turn had been observing the Seekers in order to study the psychology of failed prophecy up close. In the 1956 book, When Prophecy Fails, lead author Leon Festinger coined the phrase cognitive dissonance to describe the psychology of expectation versus disappointment that his team had observed in the Seekers cult. It is a foundational text of modern psychology, which is ironic, for Hubbard spent his remaining life denouncing the whole profession for rejecting Dianetics as pseudoscience. What Festinger's team had discovered, and that Lafayette Ronald Hubbard had already worked out, is that spiritual seekers are a dime a dozen. There's a sucker born every minute, P.T. Barnum observed of we pilgrims, and nothing sucks us in like a good story. Audiences crave to hear the stories they already believe, while people will gladly suspend their disbelief for an entertaining magician. Hubbard never really studied the faith or traditions or cultures of the human spiritual past very deeply while he borrowed and remixed them. Instead, he fictionalized them as a pastiche. It is obvious, and furthermore, it is most obvious in the places where L. Ron Hubbard pretends to be most scientific. His influence on the most famous and infamous UFO cults is less widely understood as history, though, and therefore worth exploring in future essays.